Hello, everyone. Welcome to another thrilling episode of Tim and Tom's Film Nights. I'm Timothy, the audio technician turned podcast host extraordinaire.
And I am Thomas, your resident painter turned hiking enthusiast turned podcast co-host. We hope you're all settled in with a nice cup of tea or coffee, ready to dive into the world of film.
Tonight, we have a real treat for you, a movie that has caused quite the stir among our viewers. It's called The Substitute. Failure is not an option. Thomas, what do you make of this title?
I must admit, Timothy, it's certainly attention-grabbing. It sets up high stakes right away and makes one curious about the story behind it. As a fan of action thrillers, I have high hopes for this film.
Well, my dear Tom, I'm afraid your excitement may be in vain. This movie was an absolute disappointment for me. The plot was predictable, the characters were one-dimensional, and the acting left much to be desired.
Oh, Timothy, you always have such a pessimistic view on things. Give it a chance before you write it off entirely.
But I must speak my truth, Tom. And in this case, the truth hurts. But let's not get too bogged down by my negativity. What about you? What did you think of The Substitute? Failure is not an option.
Well, Timothy, I must admit that it's not a masterpiece of cinema, but it did manage to keep my attention throughout its runtime. The action sequences were well executed and the plot, while predictable, was engaging enough to hold me captivated.
Well, Tom, I'm glad you found something redeemable in this mess of a film. But let's talk about the plot for a moment. We have an ex-mercenary, Karl Thomasson, played by Treat Williams, who is forced to go undercover as a faculty member at a military school to stop a group of white supremacists from gaining access to some powerful weapon.
Yes, it does sound like a typical action flick plotline, but the twist is that Karl himself has a personal connection to one of the students at the school, which adds an emotional layer to his motivations. And I must say, the final showdown was quite thrilling.
Tom, let's not get too carried away with our praises for this film. The plot is thin, the characters are cliched, and the dialogue is often cringe-worthy. I mean, really, failure is not an option. We get it. We get it.
Well, Timothy, I think you're being a bit too harsh. Sure, the writing might not be Shakespearean, but this is an action thriller we're talking about. People watch these films for explosions, gunfire, and testosterone-filled dialogues. And in that regard, The Substitute Failure is not an option delivers.
Well, Tom, I suppose we will just have to agree to disagree on this one. But before we move on to our next topic, I would like to ask you something about the film. I noticed that there were some scenes shot in London, my beloved city. Can you share any interesting behind-the-scenes tidbits from the production?
Oh, Timothy, you know how much of a camera hog you can be sometimes. Yes, as a matter of fact, there was some filming done at various landmarks in London, including St. Paul's Cathedral and Trafalgar Square. And I heard that the cast and crew had to deal with some unexpected weather conditions during shooting, which delayed production for a few days.
That sounds quite challenging for everyone involved.
Well, thank you, Tom,
for sharing your thoughts on The Substitute. Failure is not an option. I suppose we should move on to our next film review, shall we? Well, Tom, I'm glad we could find some common ground on the film's shooting location. Now, let's move on to our next topic, a little-known fact about the production process of The Substitute. Failure is not an option. It turns out that the director, Robert Radler, had quite a unique approach to casting for one particular role in the movie. Can you guess which character I am referring to?
I think I have a good idea. You're talking about the role of the villainous white supremacist leader, right? It has to be Trevor something or other.
Very close, Tom. But, no, it wasn't Trevor. The character you mentioned was actually played by an actor named Trevor Lampkin.
No.
The role I am talking about was originally intended for a well-known British actor, but due to scheduling conflicts, he had to decline the offer.
Can you guess who that talented gentleman was?
Oh, well, Timothy, given your fondness for historical dramas, and the fact that we're discussing a film released in 2001, my first thought would be Sir Ian McKellen.
Almost there, Tom. While Sir Ian McKellen is indeed an incredible actor and would have been a fantastic addition to the cast, I was actually referring to another British legend. Can you guess who it was?
Oh, well, if we're sticking with historical figures and actors known for their portrayals of them, I'd say Sir Laurence Olivier.
Not quite, Tom, but close enough to be impressed. The actor who was originally cast but had to decline due to scheduling conflicts was none other than, drumroll, Sir Kenneth Branagh.
Yes.
The same man who brought iconic characters like Hamlet and Macbeth to life on screen almost played the villainous white supremacist leader in The Substitute. Failure is not an option. Can you imagine?
I don't think my aging heart could handle such a shock, Timothy. It would have been pure cinematic gold. But alas, we got Trevor Lampkin instead. I mean, he was okay. He did a fine job, considering the limited resources and time constraints they had to work with.
Well, Tom, you know how the saying goes, the show must go on. And despite the casting setbacks and a shoestring budget, the film still managed to entertain millions of viewers worldwide. So let's wrap up today's episode by reflecting on that miracle of modern cinema, The Substitute. Failure is not an option.
I couldn't have said it better myself, Timothy. It just goes to show that even when life throws you a curveball, like losing Sir Kenneth Branagh to some silly Shakespearean adaptation, you gotta learn how to make lemonade out of Trevor Lampkin's acting abilities.
Well said, Tom.
And speaking of adaptations, did you know that The Substitute,
Failure is Not an Option, was actually based on a popular graphic novel series?
I had no idea, Timothy. I'm not much of a comic book guy, but I'll take your word for it. The storyline did have some similarities to the original source material, albeit with some creative liberties taken by the screenwriters.
Yes, creative liberties. Speaking of which, one thing that always bugs me about action movies, like, this is the unrealistic depiction of how quickly people can learn complex skills. Like, Karl Thomasson goes from being a regular guy to becoming a skilled martial artist and marksman within days.
Well, Timothy, it's just a movie. If they showed us the grueling training process in detail, we'd be sitting here all day instead of discussing it. Besides, I think the audience enjoys seeing the underdog triumph over adversity in a matter of minutes, don't they?
I suppose you're right, Tom. But as a retired audio technician who worked for the BBC, I have a bit more of an affinity for accuracy. Now, let's talk about the cinematography. What did you think of the aerial shots of the military school and surrounding area?
Oh, Timothy, you always focus on the technical stuff, don't you? I thought they were quite impressive, especially considering the tight budget they had to work with. The drone operators did a fantastic job capturing the grandeur of the campus and its surroundings.
Well, it does set the stage for the film, doesn't it? A peaceful military school nestled in the heart of rural America, unaware of the sinister forces lurking beneath the surface. Speaking of AIM lurking, we haven't yet discussed the villainous white supremacist group at the center of this story.
Oh, I almost forgot about them. They were quite, compelling, let's say. The leader, played by Trevor Lampkin, had a certain charisma that made you root for him to fail spectacularly. And the rest of the group? Well, they were just there to look menacing and deliver cliched racist rants, weren't they?
I suppose that's par for the course in these types of films, Tom. But let's not dwell on the negatives too much. The substitute failure is not an option, had its share of redeemable moments, even if it didn't quite live up to the high standards set by its predecessors.
I agree, Timothy. It's not a masterpiece of cinema, but it was entertaining enough to pass the time on a lazy Saturday afternoon. And who doesn't love seeing Trevor Lampkin get his just desserts in the end?
Speaking of endings, we've rambled on quite enough about this mediocre action flick. I suppose we should wrap up today's episode with a few words of wisdom from our wise and elderly selves, Tom. Well, Tom, we can't talk about a film without discussing its cast, can we? Let's start with Trevor Lampkin as the villainous white supremacist leader.
Well, I think he did an okay job, considering the limited resources and time constraints they had to work with. You know, making him look menacing and all that jazz. But personally, I always thought Sir Kenneth Branagh would have brought a bit more charisma to the role.
I agree, Tom. However, Trevor Lampkin did manage to convey the necessary air of danger and malice required for the role. Now, let's talk about Treat Williams as Karl Thomasson, the reluctant hero who infiltrates the group.
Ah, Treat Williams. He's been in some truly iconic roles, hasn't he? The man can act. There's no denying that. As for his portrayal of Karl Thomasson, I think he nailed it. You know, the struggling father figure trying to make ends meet and all that stuff.
I must admit, Tom, that Treat Williams did a commendable job of portraying the character's conflicting emotions throughout the film.
Now,
let's not forget about the supporting cast, including the school principal played by Linda Parkinson Wells and her assistant, played by A.M. Tom Smithson.
Linda Parkinson Wells was fantastic as always, wasn't she? She brought a certain warmth to the otherwise cold environment of the military school. And Tom Smithson? Well, he did his job, didn't he? He played the stereotypical mean old man who doesn't understand young people and their crazy ideas about equality and stuff like that.
Well said, Tom. And lastly, we should mention the supporting cast members, including some familiar faces from the 80s action movie scene. They all did a fine job of adding depth to the film's setting.
Oh, you mean like that guy who played the wise old Native American chief? You know, the one with the feather in his hat? Yeah, he was cool. He always had some, wise words to say during the important parts of the movie.
Well, said Tom, and I think we've covered enough about the cast and their performances in The Substitute. Failure is not an option. Shall we move on to discussing the cultural impact of this film?
Oh, you mean how the film addresses sensitive topics like racism and white supremacist ideology? Well, Timothy, I think it's important to mention that while The Substitute, failure is not an option, might not be a groundbreaking masterpiece in terms of its handling of these issues, it did spark conversations.
Yes, Tom. It brought these topics into the mainstream discourse and it made people question their own prejudices. I remember watching it with my grandchildren and they had so many questions about why people would think like that. And you know what? That's a good thing, isn't it?
Absolutely, Timothy. Art has always been a powerful tool for provoking thought and sparking change. Even if the execution may not always be perfect, I believe films like this can still make a difference in shaping our collective understanding of complex issues.
And let's not forget about its impact on the action genre itself. It paved the way for more gritty, grounded, and realistic portrayals of heroes battling against overwhelming odds. You know, like that scene where Karl Thomasson single-handedly takes down a squadron of fully armed white supremacists.
I remember it well. It was best changer for the action genre, Timothy. It showed audiences that one person can make a difference if they're determined enough. Plus, it had some pretty cool fight scenes and explosions, which is always a bonus in my book.
Indeed, Tom. And let's not forget about its soundtrack. That theme song, Born to Fight by AIM, insert random rock band, name still gets me pumped up even after countless viewings.
Speaking of countless viewings, Timothy, I think we've probably talked enough about this film for today's episode. What do you say we wrap things up and leave our dear viewers with a gripping question related to the cultural impact of The Substitute? Failure is not an option.
Oh, that's a good idea, Tom. So, viewers, what are your thoughts on the cultural impact of this film? Did it leave any lasting impression on you? And if so, how did it shape your understanding of complex issues like racism and white supremacist ideology?
Well, Timothy, it's been a wild ride discussing The Substitute. Failure is not an option. While it might not be the finest example of cinematic masterpieces, I believe it has its place in film history. It sparked conversations about sensitive topics like racism and white supremacist ideology, which is always a good thing.
And as a retired audio technician who worked for the BBC, I can attest to the film's mediocre technical aspect. However, it did have its moments of thrills and suspense that kept me on the edge of my seat.
Speaking of seats, we should probably wrap things up before our own butts fall asleep. So, dear viewers, what were your thoughts on The Substitute? Failure is not an option. Did it leave a lasting impact on you? And most importantly, don't forget to comment, subscribe, and hit that like button below.
Indeed, Tom. Let's hear from our lovely viewers about their thoughts on this film. Until next time, stay safe, wear your seatbelts. And remember, treat everyone with respect, regardless of their color, creed, or beliefs.
And if all else fails, you can always rely on a good action movie to help you vent your frustrations safely. So until next time, keep watching, keep discussing, and most importantly, don't forget to share your thoughts with us.